Sorry, got to see me again, but don't worry, I'm only here for 5 minutes, and then later on I'm going to pass the time to Rizwan as well as Jishan. So in this session, we are going to help you to make sense on the risk assessment management process that's under the Singapore Standard SS 7102-024. And then later on, Rizwan will also explain to you that there is a resource guide that is on the OE Council website, which is the Emergency Action Plan. Now, both the Emergency Action Plan and Risk Assessment Management Plan is part of the requirement or mandated statements in the Singapore standards. All right. So now we can quickly look into this framework. Now, in this Singapore standard, there are some frameworks that are in the Singapore standards. All right. So this is one of the framework. So under this framework, it covers the risk assessment and management framework. Now, like what I say, most of the companies would have your risk assessment management plan. As long as you do MOE schools before, you definitely have your RAMs, you definitely have your safety policy. All right. So basically, we are just telling you what is required so that it is like a checklist. You have it, very good. You don't have it, and then you may want to take some time to consolidate these documents. Sometimes you may not have the document, but you are able to articulate it. All right. So if you are able to articulate it, my next proposal to you is what you articulate, write it down in the document. So under the risk assessment, there are 3 components that we look at. One is the identification of risk. How you identify the risk, how you classify your risk, how you determine what type of risk hazard whether the hazard or activity is. You analyze it, and then you evaluate. So most of the MOE schools will probably use the 5x5 matrix. All right. So when you do your evaluation, this is where you use a 5x5 matrix. Whether is it significant, insignificant, whether is it moderate risk or high risk. So all this, there is a 5x5 matrix. Later on, Jishan and the team will explain to you what are the best practices that you can use. You can copy it wholesale and do it on your own, or you have your own risk assessment management as long as you address the key pointers of the risk assessment. Then we have the management component. Is once you identify the risk, like I always say to my client, once you are aware of the risk, you cannot be unaware of the risk. So once you identify the risk, you must mitigate the risk. How do you mitigate the risk? Again, we don't mandate how you mitigate. But of course, there are some best practices that you may want to adopt. How you communicate your risk assessment plan. So a lot of time, you may have 1, 2, 3, 4. Identification, analyzing, evaluating, and mitigating. In any of the potential assessment is where we want to look at how you communicate to your client as well as your instructors or your activity leadership. So you may have a very good plan on risk assessment, implementation of a good risk assessment. But if there is no one action to the plan, then your comms and your implementation is something that you need to work on. All right, so I know an organization, you got a very good document, but when we ask your staff, the staff say, this is the first time I see this document. Then there is something wrong with the communication. So communication comes with training, at the same time implementation, and sometimes you may do a bit of drilling, a tabletop exercise. All right, so mitigating, communication, and whenever there is an incident or when there's a time for you to do a review after X number of years, this is where your review process starts, to look at whether your current risk assessment matrix makes sense. Whether if there is any other available resources out there to mitigate the risk. Because changes may take place, technology may change. When there's, like what one of the participants said, when AI comes in, sometimes certain AI or certain technology may help you to mitigate the risk. So this is where you look at certain review period for you to review your risk assessment. All right. Now, under the risk assessment management plan, the steps of formulating the risk assessment plan shall include the following. So this one mandated or not mandated? Mandated means in your risk assessment plan, you must be able to articulate your risk, your identification of risk, analyzing the identified risk to map up associated risk. So hazard to risk, identifying and evaluating the risk not associated with the identified hazard, Categorizing the risk is to facilitate risk mitigation. Developing processes or procedure to mitigate the risk. Communicating your risk mitigation procedure. Who is the person that's implementing, and how you review your risk assessment plan. Now, this one, it will make total sense for everybody. Why? Because if you do MOE schools, you will know the risk assessment matrix. And the risk assessment matrix, you will have your risk identification, what are the potential risks, you measure the risk and the likelihood, the impact and the likelihood. Then, how do you mitigate? Who is in charge of this? And what is the action plan? Actually, whatever you do in MOE 5x5 matrix, somewhat or rather have addressed most of this. But if you don't, then this is where you need to start to document these processes into your company risk assessment or safety management policies. All right? Now, I know it's very small. It will say that, okay, in assessing and managing risks, the potential harm associated with the OOE program shall be evaluated by the provider. Compulsory or not compulsory? Compulsory. Means, but we didn't determine how you do it. Means how you do it, you are able to tell us how you're going to do it. But if we say that shall be evaluated by the provider using this particular matrix, then you need to use the matrix. But as of now, there is no such matrix. But further on, they did say that the risk assessment management process should include. So should is mandated or not mandated? Not mandated, but highly recommended that you should have this as part of your evaluating of your risk. Does it make sense? All right. Once you read the document, all you need to do is shall, should, may, can statement. Now, under the emergency management, Rizwan later on will explain to you the emergency action plan. Now, the emergency action plan is written in accordance to this standard. All right. What is the activity type? What is the risk assessment and management? And then in the event of emergency, what will be your primary procedure, secondary procedure, tertiary procedure? How do you recover? Your preparation, response, recovery, and then later on a review of your emergency action plan. So this is a framework, but this framework has been already been translated to a physical document called the EAP, the Emergency Action Plan, which Rizwan is going to share with you later on. All right, so we look something like this. This is available on the OE Council website. You don't have to pay for it, but if you want to pay for it, you can, but there's no way for you to pay for it. All this has already is written. Most statements are written in accordance to the SS. So when this document was first developed, before the SS. So we also take reference from this SS. Sorry, we take reference from this SS to develop this EA plan. Okay? Ken? If not, I'm going to pass the time to Jishan. So Jishan is going to share with you some of the best practices and what is required as part of the risk assessment. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Delane. All right. Good morning to everyone. Good to see a lot of familiar faces. So, for those of you who have not seen me before, just a brief introduction of myself. So, my name is Zishan. I'm actually on the OAE Council. I'm one of the co-leads for the Safety and Compliance and Promotion Subcommittee. Unlike a lot of you, I'm actually from the attractions industry. Right, so my specialty is in attractions as an owner-operator and also a safety consultant for the attractions industry. Right, so my experience ranges both sitting on the panels in Singapore as well as overseas as well from an attraction safety perspective. So why am I here? Right, there's a lot of similarities. Right, so for example, in Singapore, okay, related to some of the OAE activities. Right, there were two. Now there's more. There are two main outdoor attractions that provide high ropes courses, right? One's in Sentosa called Mega Adventure. The other one is at Bedok Reservoir called Forest Adventure. Now there are a few more, right? Home Team is doing it and a few others, right? So I've had the privilege of working at both, okay, in my capacity in various different roles. So I was invited to join the council to look at the safety side of it. So I'm just going to go through some of it. So Delane mentioned two parts of Section 4, Clause 4 of the standards. We have risk management and we have EAP. So Rizwan later will talk about the emergency management portion. What I want to do today is essentially try to simplify what risk assessment is. Okay, you hear a lot of the words. You saw so many things, right? Actually, it's very simple. And in a lot of ways, you actually do risk assessment on a daily basis already without even knowing it. right? This morning you went out, you going out the house, you saw it might be raining. You're already conducting a risk assessment, right? You're assessing, should I bring an umbrella or not? Okay, the hazard may not be something that will cause you injury. Maybe it will. You might fall sick. You're already doing that in your mind. What we want to do is how do we translate that into your programs, and how to make sure that not only those people who are running the programs know about risk assessment and do all the identification, but it goes all the way down to the last person on the ground that is actually conducting it. And that's where the gap is. Right, we've realized through the council's formation that a huge portion, in a lot of things that are done, there's a lot of good work being done by a lot of organizations, but the last person on the ground doesn't probably know about it, right? And that's what we want to try to take note of. Okay, so some hygiene points. You shouldn't, or you are not allowed to take photos of the stuff we are sharing. Again, you can ask questions. Anyway, a lot of these things that we're going to share is not secret in any way. It's a lot of best practices. It's also available in public domains, right? So you don't really need to take some photos of it. Okay, so we'll get straight into it. And essentially, we've got two portions. We talked about it, right? So risk assessment and then the emergency management plan. So I'll cover risk assessment first. So the first step in risk assessment is what we call establishing a plan. Now, I want to be very clear that actually there is existing standards, or statutes in Singapore already. And these are based from the WSH Council's best practices of code of practice for risk management. So if you don't know, you can go and Google WSH Council, search for their code of practice. You can download the risk assessment, risk management plan code of practice. Actually, that document is the holy grail. That's the one you should refer to. Everything else that comes in the SS and all the other standards, take reference to that. Okay? But there's one thing that a lot of us miss out on. We always do risk assessment for the participants of the program. We forget one important aspect. The risk assessments should also cover the staff. Okay? So you must also look out for the risk associated with the staff, because it's a responsibility of an organization to ensure that you provide a safe working environment for your staff as well. And that's a WSH requirement. Okay, so a lot of people don't know this. If you have a staff incident, you are mandated to report, right, to MOM, WSH division, and they will normally come down and ask you first question, where's your risk assessment, where's your safety management plan? And a few organizations have got caught out because they show what they do for participants, but they don't have anything written for the staff. Okay, so that's something I want to share with you guys today. So 3 things, very simple, right? We talk about risk assessment, and then risk management in that order. So risk is essentially the likelihood and severity of something happening, something adverse happening. Okay, so you just have to remember likelihood and severity, because this relates later to your matrix, whether you use a 3x3 or 5x5. Essentially, we're talking about likelihood and severity. Okay, so that's how we define risk. Then we talk about risk assessment. Okay, essentially it's about evaluating those risks and coming up with control measures. Okay, so the first step is to identify, think about severity and likelihood, and then you evaluate and come up with your control measures. Okay. Last one is then the risk management process or the plan itself. And that's essentially a framework, right? Dylan has showed that earlier, that encompasses everything. Now that you've identified the risk, you come out with a control measures, what you're going to do next, how you communicate, how you document, how you ensure that it's effective. All right. So that's the key parts of how you develop a RM plan. The next one is the scope of the plan. Okay. So essentially it's about creating awareness. Okay, the whole purpose of doing it is to then create the awareness that such risks exist. Someone used to ask me, how do we ensure that we conduct an activity with no risk? Right? And the answer is, don't do the activity. Okay? You can't. You can't think of, there's no way that you can mitigate all risk. However, you can ensure that you put a control measure that gets it to as low as possible. The risk is mitigated to as low as possible. Okay? In most cases, we talk about what you can control and what you can't control. The thing that you can't control very, very simply is how people behave. You can have the best safety processes, you can have the best communication, you can have the best safety briefing, you can get the best videos, you can use AI and all the technology, but you cannot mitigate for how an individual will react for whatever reason. You can't, right? So you cannot have a situation where your risk assessment, you said, look, I have considered all factors, no such thing. Because there will be factors that you may not know of. Okay, and that's fine. Okay, the risk assessment process doesn't mandate you need to think of every single thing. No. It talks about your best effort looking at the activity and understanding what you need to do. So that's the awareness portion. Then you need to identify who's going to be at risk. And this is the important part that a lot of people miss out. It's not only the participants, it's the staff. If you're operating in a public environment, could what you do affect someone who is not even a participant, someone who's watching, someone who's around you? Could the activity affect them? And if the answer is yes, then you got to make sure you put some sort of mitigation in place. Then the control program, right? What's a control program? The control program could be as simple as, if there is a risk of something falling from height, use a helmet. As simple as that, right? So I'm going to simplify a lot of things just to give you the basics of it, right? The details is up to you. Okay, there is no right or wrong in a risk assessment. So there is no consultant that can come to you and look at a risk assessment and say, this is wrong. No. Unless you do it wrongly. Okay? But an external person can come and tell you, hey, you know what? I've looked at your risk, your assessed risk, I've looked at your control measures. Perhaps you could consider doing something more. Perhaps you could mitigate the risk better in these ways. Okay, so suffice to say, as long as you have a risk, okay, so control program, right? And with your control program, like what Dylan shared earlier, it's always good to adhere to best practices and standards. So there are enough reference points out there. So even if you try to Google some, incidents, you'll start to see when there are incidents that are reported, there will be some learnings, some causal factors that you can use and then say, okay, this has happened before. Does it apply to me? Can I use that as a learning? And how do I ensure that I'm safer because of it? Then we talk about determining if your existing control measures are adequate or not. Okay? And one of the key things, again, is who do you consult next? Do you look for experts? Do you look for someone in the organization who's a bit more experienced? Do you look for external resources? Right? To this end, what the council is doing, we shared earlier that there is an emergency action plan guide. Okay? The subcommittee for safety and compliance is currently working on a risk assessment guide as well. So this should be available hopefully within the next couple of months. Same will be a resource that can be downloaded from the OAE Council website. And the reason for this is so that you also have a guide, right, with a lot of these points here and some examples that you can use, whether you're doing land-based, water-based, height-based. What we're trying to do is create a repository of common hazard and control measures, right, that you could start to use as reference points. Okay, you can copy and paste, no problem. But if you copy and paste and don't implement, no point. All right. Once you do that, then the last 3 points are, how do you prevent injuries and illnesses? Okay, that's the whole purpose of it. How do you prioritize then those hazards and control measures? Okay, take note that when you look at hazard and control measures, if you are already doing it, if it's already part of your process, then it's not a hazard. Okay, so for example, if you say, in my activity, I go back to, we don't operate in wet weather. Part of your activity program. Wet weather, no operations. You don't operate in wet weather. If it's past a certain time, you don't operate at night. Then some people put in their risk assessment, what is the hazard? Getting lost operating at night. Doesn't match. If you're already doing it, then it's no longer a risk. So don't copy blindly or don't just take points blindly. Think. You got to think through your each phase of your activity. Does it apply to you? If it doesn't apply and your activity already has, so things like PPE. If you say that I'm doing height-based, PPE is a requirement. Some of the hazards people have, what I've seen before, right? Not using PPE. How? If PPE is already a requirement for the activity, how can there be a situation where not using PPE? Then it's no longer a hazard. Then you have an issue with your whole program. But it could be wrong size of PPE, right? Damaged PPE. PPE not used in the correct way. Yes, those are considered your risk. All right? Last one is to consult stakeholders. So this is important aspect as well to make sure that your risk assessment plan goes through the entire chain. So it's not only the people who are your management. Management obviously needs to know, right? For those of you who are not aware, actually, from a WSH perspective, the directors, CEOs, top management of a company are required to go for what used to be called the Be Safe Level 1, right? The top executive program. Okay, and what that is a one-day course to inform the bosses of the company that if anything happens, guess what? We're coming after you. Simple as that. Why? Because safety has to start from the top. If your bosses and the people who are in charge of the company are not taking safety seriously, then it's not going to happen. Okay, so consulting stakeholders, not only your management, but also making sure that even the last person on the ground, your part-time casual instructors that you come on, they are also important part of you running your program. They also need to understand what the risks are so that they can help you and enact the control measures. Okay. All right, so we talked about the framework. Okay, Dylan went through it already. I'm not going to spend too much time, but essentially we're talking about assessment and management. All right, so you got to identify, analyze, evaluate, mitigate. I am assuming, and I'm sure a lot of you have seen your risk assessment worksheet or the form, right? If you fill in those forms, you have already complied with all of this, except for the review portion. Okay, right? The review portion actually is at the top of the sheet, but it's just a static thing. You just put a date, right? But if you don't do anything about it, then it's not counted as part of the framework. Okay. So the process, again, I've taken this off the WSH guide. So it's something that you would be doing already, right? It starts with preparation, you form a team. So this is the other thing that we've noticed a lot of organizations don't do. They don't form a risk assessment team. Okay, so some people ask, what is a risk assessment team? Who should be in the risk assessment team? You need to have an RA leader, right? The person who then has enough experience on the hazards and control measures, who understands the program that you are doing, and then anyone else who's conducting the program can be part of the team. Okay? Now there's another requirement that a lot of people don't know. By right, from the WSH Act, that RA leader and the RA team should attend what is called the Be Safe Level 2 course. Okay? So I know for those of you who are working in government organizations, IHLs, right? You would have, part of your training would already include the Be Safe Level 2. But for the private operators, right? You probably don't know about it. Okay, it's a 3-day course. You can use WSG funding and all that kind of stuff. It's actually very, very useful. So your RA team should go for this course. Okay, once they go for this course, the course is titled Risk Management Plan. 3-day course. Unfortunately, I'll say this out loud because it's something that I've been very critical of, and I'm trying to work with WSH Council on this, is that when you go for this course, everything in that course is about construction industry. Everything. Forklift, scaffold, how people fall from height, okay? And there's a reason for that, right? The reason for that is that's the industry that needs it the most, okay? And that's the industry that WSH, MOM regulates, enforces the most, okay? But going for the course will give you an understanding of how they look at it. In fact, learning from the construction industry is a very useful thing because it happens all the time, right? And over time, they've developed a lot of useful control measures, mitigating measures on how they deal with those risks to prevent deaths, okay? So forming a team, very important. Then you start to do your risk assessment, right? Hazard identification, evaluation, control, and then you implement. Implementation on the ground, again, it's not a case of writing it on a piece of paper. It's really taking your team through it through your training to look at it. So part of your training should, as a best practice, include a part for risk assessment for that activity with your instructors, if you can. Some people will tell me, I don't have a lot of full-time staff, right? We get the part-time instructors who come and join us just for the camp, for example. It's fine. It only takes 5 to 10 minutes. If you can cater 5 to 10 minutes before everything starts to just bring them and use the risk assessment as a tool, you can take them through it. And if you don't even have that time, pick out what are the 3 most high risk items in your risk assessment form. Pick those 3 things out because you know those are the ones that probably will cause the biggest issues. Communicate that, brief that, show people what your control measure means so that they understand. Right? You can start from there. And then later on, you can start to see what else you want to put on. Record keeping. Okay, so record keeping, again, it's all the documentation. WSH Council also says 3 years for your risk assessments. In fact, WSH Council also mandates a 3-year review. Okay, later you will see that I'm recommending you should do it every year. Okay, why? Safety and risk should be an ongoing process. So the physical paperwork you should review every year as part of your whole team and process. That doesn't mean that once you do the risk assessment, you leave it for a year and don't see it anymore. It should be a constant process. Every program, every activity, every time you run something, when you start as part of your daily checks, opening checks, closing checks, as part of management walkarounds, you can use that as an opportunity to very quickly start to identify some of your hazards, talk about your control measures. Okay? And then last part is about review. Okay, then we go into communication. All right, so before we go into communication, the process as well. So I'm just showing an example of a 5x5 matrix. Now, matrix has so many. There's 3x3, there's 5x5, there's some other people use, some other countries use different matrix. Essentially, it goes back into likelihood and severity, and at what point do you classify what is acceptable risk and not acceptable risk. Okay, so this is an example of what a 5x5 matrix looks like. It shows you the scores. Essentially anything, then it tells you if it's low risk, anything in green, scoring 1 to 3, fine, you don't have to do anything. If you're at medium risk, what do you have to do? If you're at high risk, what do you have to do? This can be different for different companies. Okay, again, you look at the WSH Act, they give you a reference point. Now, if, for example, we say that number 12 is high risk, WSH Council states, 5x5, we said number 12 is high risk. Can you say, no, for me, number 15 is high risk? Okay? Not wrong, Not wrong. However, if something happens, they will still use and say, how come you say 15 is okay? Because why? You operate in different environment. So you must be able to justify why. Okay? This is just a tool. So this is an example. So 5x5 is the most commonly used. Why? Because it has many layers. If you use a 3x3, you might end up, in my opinion, you use a 3x3, you might end up going a no-go, very binary. Right? It's either can or cannot. If you go 5x5, you have a few other layers. Your risk assessment in terms of your scoring for your hazard and control, your likelihood and severity, you have got a bit more leeway to look at it. Okay, and determine what is the best course of action. Okay, again, that's my preference. Then we talk about communication. All right, so safety induction on the first day is very important. All right, and that shouldn't just include the staff coming on and then telling them what's the company's safety policy. It's also about talking to them about the environment that they're going to be working in, what kind of hazard and controls that you already have. Okay. Second point, I spoke about this earlier, ensuring that the risk assessment is part of your training. Okay, it's very easy to do. It shouldn't take long. You should incorporate it as part of your training so that everyone is involved. In most cases, right, the hazards are always identified by the guys on the ground because they do it day in and day out. The RA leader or the management who sign off on that document in some cases have no idea what's actually the hazard on the ground. Okay, so making sure that the guys from the ground are involved in this process is extremely important. Then also trying to conduct risk assessment as part of your daily toolbox meetings, right? So toolbox meetings, opening briefing, whatever you want to call it. At the start of the day when you gather your team, try to include that. If you can't do it at that point in time because there's no time, when they start to do their opening checks for the activities, they can use that opportunity to look out for hazards and report it backwards. Okay? And then debrief at the end of the day is also very important. So sometimes you may not have a hazard that happens, but when you participate in activity, whether it's kayaking, whether it's high ropes, at the end of the day, you might notice some things, whether it's wear and tear, equipment damage, right? All of these then contributes to being part of a hazard. Now, does it mean that then you straight away take out your risk assessment worksheet and you put it in? Don't have to. But essentially, as long as you have a process of how you log these issues and deal with them, then you are good to go. Okay? There's one more thing I missed out was about safe work procedures. Okay, so safe work procedures are more for your staff. Okay, so when you create the risk assessment, what you can also do is then look out for what we call safe work procedures. Very simple. You talk about what you do, what the do's and don'ts, right? Is there any PPE required for your staff? What do they need to take note of at every aspect of their work, before work, during work, after work, right? It can be a very simple 1-2 page document. You can put it up on your notice board. You can share it with your staff via PDF. Whatever it is. If you take casual and part-time instructors for your programs, right? Create a simple WhatsApp group, share it. So everyone reads and understands and they can raise questions if there's any issues. Okay. Second last point is about risk assessment being available. So again, it should be available. It should be a document that is written, then filed away and kept in a cupboard. It should be something that anyone can ask for. Can I have a look at the risk assessment? Can I have a look at some of the hazard and control measures? I noticed that something wasn't done correctly. So this constant review by anyone and making sure that it's available is a very good practice to have. Right? Some organizations, they even do this. They put the risk assessment in a notice board. The actual risk assessment, they just place it there. Right? Inside a folder, anyone can just pick it up and read it. Okay, you can do that as well if you feel comfortable to do that. Last one is about the review. Right? So again, by law, 3 years. Okay? Best practice, do it 1 year. Okay, and only makes sense because if you are doing high volume of what the activities that you are doing, every year things might change. In fact, every 6 months things might change. So utilize that annual review as part of a good process to ensure that you are reviewing your RMPs and make sure it's communicating any new control measures, right? If nothing changes, if the risks are all the same, at the very least, your control measures may change. You may use technology, you may see things differently, you may use external auditors, inspectors to mitigate some of those risks. So there's always something to update on an annual basis. Right, last point is about contingency plan. So the SS standards talks about making sure you have a contingency plan. So what's a contingency plan, right? To me, and this is some of the points that I wanted to raise today, is essentially this contingency planning. Take note, when you do a risk assessment, right, you cannot say, okay, I've put in 90%, the rest 10% contingency. No such thing. You should look at all that is within the scope of what you're doing. Contingency then deals with anything outside. Anything that you didn't take note of. So to me, this is where if you have a safety officer or management team or your RA leader, this is where these guys come in. Okay? They come in, or even your program supervisor. That's where they come in to help the organization look at what other things can happen. Okay, based on the activity that you're conducting. Okay, so a way to do your contingency plan also involves some of the tools that practitioners use for risk assessment. Things like FMEA, so failure mode effects analysis, right? So this is normally for equipment. If you got equipment, you got machinery, you do FMEA, right? What can fail in that equipment or machinery? Or the simple one is what if this happens, what if that happens, right? Think through. And this is normally a process that is done in a team. So you get everyone's view and you start to think of what are the other aspects of the hazards or the control measures that you can implement. The last one is about having a process to review any near misses or incidents. So as an organization, you may have, if you're operating regularly enough, you may have daily near misses, incidents, right? I can share in the attractions, we have near misses every day, right? We can have incidents every day. We're not afraid of it. It's openly reported. The reason why it's openly reported is so that we can ensure that our safety systems are robust, right? And near misses are very, very important. Near misses are important so that you can, as an organization, you can identify what we call weak signals. You may do something and then something always happens. Someone always trips. The simple one is this: someone can always trip at a certain place due to activity design. If no one reports it, one day someone's going to have a bad accident there. But if everyone reports, and daily someone is reporting that there is a slip, trip and fall potential at a particular place, right? And it happens often enough, you know that you're going to do something about it. Whether you coordinate off, you look at what's causing the issue, so on and so forth, right? So the whole idea of near miss reporting and incident reporting and looking at your incidents that have happened is to really give you that trend analysis to make you understand, are there any areas that you may have missed out, or what you have deemed as low risk actually might slowly creep up to becoming high risk, and then how you can deal with it effectively. Okay, so that is all I have for risk management plan. Like I said, the whole purpose was to try to make it simpler for you to understand how to do things. Later on at the end, we'll have some Q&A. So if you have any questions, I think you can leave it till the end. If not, I will hand over to Rizwan to talk about emergency management. Thanks.
Thank you, Zasan. Okay, for those who don't know me, I'm Wan. I'm in the council same as Zasan, in the same committee. In terms of exposure to safety and emergency management, over the last decade or so, I was involved with the IHLs mainly. Spent a few years managing BCA-approved skills center in Bangladesh, and also sending staff to our foreign workers to Middle East in terms of their safety certifications. So my approach for now is more of to give you a flavor of what to expect for those who have not gotten the standards. Right? What are the various sections of these standards, and just to make correlations to what was shared just now by Jason. Okay? So it's going to be a whirlwind tour because I want to spend time to answer questions later on. And just to bear in mind, just now as per what Delin mentioned, your questions should be able to be answered by us. So it should, right? So sometimes if I don't know, I will just say, I don't know. Okay, I'm not going to throw smoke and that kind of stuff. Okay, so under section 4.4.1, we know that basically after all this RA planning, very sweet, right? You get your Be Safe 3 or whatever, you must prepare for the what ifs. Okay, so in emergency management, we think about from the practitioner perspective, we got to ask ourselves, okay, what is my exposure as an instructor? All right, as a provider, you got to ask yourself, what are my exposure as a provider? Now, having known your exposures, that may guide you in terms of what you need to address in the first place. All right, example, right? Provider A, if your core business is providing programs to maybe those so-called higher class institutions, right, with higher class parents and blah, 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 then your exposure may be a bit more versus company B who provides, programs for maybe a different client profile, for example. Okay, makes sense, right? And of course, again, EM is not rocket science. All of us on a daily basis always prepare for emergencies, correct? Those of us who are married, you know whether your wife got a secret account or not, for example, joint accounts and everything else, right? So these are all part of emergency planning. Just in case I go off, my wife has her own account, right? So same thing, okay? So we know that basically this can happen anytime and it requires you to react, all right? And in the OA context, it's not limited to incidents, which can be the result of your damage to property or equipment. In this case, injury to people, incidents, illness, or even death. These are just some examples as quoted in the standards, right? And again, all these incidents can be because of all other things. Equipment failure, human error, those that may not have been addressed in your risk assessment planning process. That's how they are connected, okay? So in terms of the objectives, again, we ask ourselves, we want to prepare, correct? To prepare and to respond and to recover. Now, what you see here is a so-called a three-step process. There are many processes to crisis management, all right? If you just ask ChatGPT, what are the 5 R's or 6 R's of crisis management, they will give you everything. But typically, it involves the first R, which is reduction. You ask yourself, what you need to reduce in terms of the risk of your programs, right? Once you've addressed those, that is in a sense is addressed by your RA plan. Now ask yourself, okay, now this is the next R, which is respond. Okay, how do I respond to any emergencies? Once you respond, in this case, when things happen, you nip in the bud, prevent further escalation. And you ask yourself, next R, how can I resume the critical operations after that incident, for example? After you resume, then you think about how do you recover everything else? Okay, in order for you to return to 100% normal business, BAU. Right? And of course, the last R we talk about, after everything else, you must being out educators, you must always debrief, right? Review lah. Okay, simple process you can follow. Right? So again, the other is, all this is to aim to eliminate or limit your severity. In this case, is to limit your exposure. Okay, exposure in this case, for example, lawsuits. Right? If you're on the States, you can be sued anytime. Correct? So that's one option. All right. So again, the intent of you want to mitigate all this so that you can resume normal operations as fast as possible. Right. Next section, when we talk about EM planning levels, so just now Dylan have kind of shared with you the process. Okay. And again, to emphasize the part about, we talk about there must be an overall plan for maybe your company or your operations. Okay. So for those of us who are familiar with all this planning, something called the ERM, Enterprise Risk Management. So you ask yourself as an enterprise, as a company, what are the key risks to my operations? Financial, physical, admin, and what have you. Then you go down to your normal RA plans lah. Okay? So that's part where, again, you ask yourself, this is my overall plan. So example, if I'm provider A, all right, I have maybe kayaking, land expedition, and high activities, right? I must have a plan to cover these three as a whole, but within these three activities, I must have my own individual plan. If I'm doing kayaking, what are my emergency plans? If I'm doing high activities, what are my emergency plans? Make sense? That's how it's translated, okay? And in this case, it shall, okay, be established, all right? And in this case, it should include all these other things: first aid, evac. All right, and how do you communicate to both your internal, which is your staff, your freelancers, all right, your employees, your contractors, or in this case, also your clients. Okay, that's why I said right now, is a basic standard expected that every school camp should go parents briefing, correct? Then they ask questions like, hey, bus got seatbelt or not, that kind of stuff lah. Okay, so these are what you need to do in terms of your SOPs. Okay, recess. Okay, so in terms of how do you develop, so as mentioned just now by Dylan, if you recall, right, is it a shall or should? This is you should. These are just best practices that you can follow. So you can adopt by, again, checking your past incidents. What are the standards that you have, for example, right? Or you ask your client organization in terms of, okay, is what I have enough for you? All right, and you can just make it, you can do it together, right? Or you consult experts and stakeholders. So in this case, if you're familiar with the 40s, you're now transferring that to somebody. That means if you have the money, you pay someone to be your crisis comms expert, for example. That means anything happens, right? You just activate this company, they come in, they do everything for you. You just sit down and shake leg lah. Okay, so again, depending on what's your purchasing power in this case. And of course, is to document the whole process as per your RA and everything else. All right, is that a fire drill? No. Okay, next up, in terms of scope. Again, these are just examples. Again, it says this they shall include but not limited to the following. So later on, if you have time, I will share with you basically the link to the EAP. All right, it's examples of how we actually classify emergencies, for example. So when we talk about types of emergencies, okay, example in MOE, there's 3 levels, right? Level 3 to 1, for example. 1 being the most severe, 3 being that you can settle yourself. Okay, now why do we need to classify emergencies or classify the types? Again, that is that if you don't classify your emergencies, that means what? Every emergency is a crisis. Correct? So again, you have to ask yourself, decide what are the critical things to do first versus, hey, this one trainer can settle. Not important. Manage yourself. Okay? Actions to be taken, the procedure in terms of, okay, who do what, who to call what, who to call who, when to call who. Okay? Access to medical emergency services. In Singapore, we are fortunate because it's very urbanized. SCDF benchmark is what? Between 8 to 11 minutes, that's your ambulance will arrive. So all these are actually available to you for you to plan your resources. Okay? Levels of emergency, evac plans, escape routes, and flowcharts and everything else. Right? So we are lucky because in Singapore it's very established. If you want to go to Bukit Timah Nature Reserve, just ask NParks, they pass you all the information, for example. Okay? All right? In terms of how do you effectively use the EM plan? Okay, so again, the other is that it says that for the effective use of EM plan, the provider shall do those few things. Okay, so if you notice over the last few slides, the word communication always appears. Okay, now this in a sense is linked to maybe the ISO 31000 for the risk management process, where while you have all your hazards, identification, your analysis, evaluation, blah, 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 right? There's also that portion where every stage must be consulted or must be communicated to your stakeholders. Okay, so again, the other is that sometimes you may have a case where your clients, they don't know what they don't know. But right now, it is an idea where you need to inform, and again, it's part of risk disclosure. All right, so even though your clients don't ask, you need to tell them, look, sit down with me. I need to tell you what will be done in case of emergencies. Okay. Because sometimes the clients, to them, I just pay money, everything's up to you. That's not the case. It must be a whole of organizational approach to risk management. Okay? Ensure priority of the EM plan by everybody else. So there lies where, again, for point D, for some of us who are maybe 2 or 3 man operators, how to do, yeah? Correct? Not to worry. Again, the council is here to help you. Can just talk to us. We can just provide options in terms of how you can manage all this if you're like a small operators. Okay, all right. And of course, the part about testing and evaluating the EM plan. So simple things like sitting down with your colleagues to do a tabletop, for example, scenario planning. Okay, just to test out that your plans are actually working. Okay. So in terms of review, similar just now, under the code of practice in WSH, your risk assessments must be reviewed every 3 years. So same thing again. You can adopt the approach where your EM plans may be reviewed after every 3 years or after each notable incident. All right? Because there may be some gaps that may have appeared but you're not aware of. Okay? There should also be roles designated. Just a sample structure, not to follow, but just from the web. And again, when you talk about roles in your EM plan, all right, the idea is that the roles must be clear, specific, and defined. All right, and sometimes we come across a case where we see a plan like that, right? So crisis team leader, John. Logistics, John. Comms person, John. Everything all John. Okay, all right. So it should be again separated carefully. All right, and of course the last portion when we talk about incident reporting and recording and monitoring. So similarly, under the WSH, employers must report certain incidents, okay, but not to fulfill the purpose, for the purpose of requirements, but again, as part of your overall safety and risk management, you need to have this, because with data, it can help you to decide future actions in terms of your own operations, okay. So here in this case, there must be frameworks or systems that you can use to record incidents and of course near misses. As rightly mentioned just now by Sresan, today's near miss not reported could be tomorrow's accident. So again, also focus on the near misses. In fact, in the WSH, they also define for you what are near misses. You can just adopt and follow accordingly. All right. I think that's all I have for this section. Okay, and of course, again, to end off with the incident reporting portion. Okay, so there must be an option where the provider shall implement the process to capture all these incidents. Okay, and they must record all this. And of course, the other is that with the system in place, both staff and contractors must know how to use it correctly. Okay, all right. Data is captured and analyzed, and of course, again, to revise in case something happens and to apply all these measures to other activities which may share the same risk. So in a nutshell, that's what section 4.4.9 is talking about. All right. I think that's all we have. For those of you who don't know, we have an OA Council website. All right. This EAP was produced last 2 years. Okay. Useful resource. Feel free to go in, read through. If you need any clarifications, concerns, questions, just approach us directly. Right? So we can just tell you why we crafted it as such. Okay. All right. With that, thank you very much. And questions. So I'm 3 minutes ahead.
Hi, Jan. Okay. Hi, my name is Anand. I'm from Home Jimenez. I've got a few questions here. Just to clarify, I did not expect any quick answer as of now, but at least to clear the air. The most important part I need to understand is about when you talk about risk assessment. You have mentioned nobody determined the mitigation, right? Nobody determined the mitigation. That means whatever that you think that is solved or lowered down is good enough. But my question now is, who determined that is enough? Is it the owner of the place or is it the provider? Because just now we heard provider, but not about the owner or the landlord or the tenant.
Okay, so it goes back into who is responsible. Okay, so ultimately it goes back into who's responsible for the activity. In most cases, it starts with so we talk about provider, right? As a provider, you are responsible to provide a safe activity. So you are the first person responsible. Now, as the procurement person or the client is also responsible, and that's why we talk about communicating to all stakeholders. The client doesn't absorb responsibility just because they have engaged you. So in the first instance, the provider, you are definitely cannot run. Okay? But the client is also responsible. So that's why the client needs to also understand. The client needs to put requirements on you to ensure. So from a court of law perspective, both are not absolved. You cannot say that I engage this person, therefore this person is responsible fully. Okay? But you may, as the provider, I can be quite certain you will bear most of the responsibility because you are controlling the program. The person who developed the program, the person who conducts the program is the one that will be responsible. So going back to your portion of which mitigation is good enough, that is why the person conducting the risk assessment should be adequately qualified and trained. If you are trained to conduct risk assessment, you will have the ability to understand how to use the 5x5 matrix or 3x3 matrix. Look at severity and likelihood. Okay. Once you understand that, you will be in a position to get it down to as low as practicable. Now that doesn't mean that even if you have that, does it mean that an incident cannot happen? No, it can still happen. Why? Because there might be factors that are outside, environmental, new person. You train the person didn't understand. You conduct a program and maybe you have a foreign student who didn't understand the safety briefing in the language. For example, there can be so many factors. But what will happen is when an incident happens, when they analyze the causal factors, they will look at your risk assessment first and look at did you put in a mitigation measure that makes sense? If it makes sense and based on what you have been doing and your experience level of the company, then you're okay. That is a mitigating measure. Again, it may not absolve you. There might be some other negligence depending on the situation, but the responsibility, going back to that, so responsibility lies with the person conducting or providing the provider. It can also lie with the end client as well. Rizwan, you want to add anything to that?
Maybe to circle back to the mitigation, correct? So when each in time where, unless the activity is very new, no one has thought about before, right? Then maybe we'll say, yes, we agree with you that your mitigation is because you're more experienced. But right now, it's kind of a standard thing where when you do your RA, right, it's good to also consult external stakeholders. So if you recall, just now we talk about communication in every process, right? So beyond your clients also, maybe consult company B, company C. Hey, how are you doing your mitigation measures for that activity? Okay, but underpinning all this, remember, we talk about the laws and regulations, right? Example, let's use COVID. When we're almost coming out from COVID, for example, right? In terms of risk measures post-COVID compared to today, have anything changed? We are more relaxed now, right? Because now we're no longer in that COVID mode. So you need to understand the context of what you're doing in terms of when you're deciding on your RA measures in this place, ask yourself, in what context are we now in? Make sense? Yep. Thanks for the question.
I want to just add one last one. So there are some organizations, in order to absolve themselves from an insurance perspective, what they do is they engage external consultants. They get an external consultant to come and audit their safety management plan, risk management plan. Okay. Again, that doesn't mean you are no longer responsible. But when an incident happens, you can say that, look, my plan, my safety management plan, my EAP, my risk management plan was audited or inspected, or I use a consultant to provide me with some context, and the consultant has given so and so recommendations, right? So all of that means that you are doing all that you can to ensure your activity is safe. So it will help in your mitigation. Okay.
Thank you, Zishan. But with that, I got three more questions there, right? We split that question. Number one, we have talked about mitigation. We know who the experts are. We know who to ask him. You have mentioned that if there's a court case, something happened. My question is, who is responsible? Is it a provider, or is it the landlord, or is it the school?
All of the above. Simple. It depends on the case. Whether it goes, it all depends. So basically what you need to understand is all stakeholders are responsible, regardless. It doesn't mean that it always goes to one. Now, how the court of law determines, that's a separate thing altogether, right? But whoever is involved in the activity, all stakeholders, you are responsible.
Great. So let's come to the next question. When it comes to provider that came to site to conduct the activity, do they need to provide their risk assessment or not? So I'm a landlord, obviously. Provider comes into my place and conducting the camp and everything. As a landlord, do I have the responsibility to ensure the provider had risk assessment, or do I don't? As long as the provider is assured.
If you are a responsible landlord, the answer is yes.
Okay. Thank you. So let's go with the next one. How about conflicts of rents? For example, the provider says, hey, this outdoor cooking do not require them to have lighter, example. But for us, when we have a risk assessment, we clearly say when lighter is involved, they must wear gloves. No need lah. Why must we have gloves? So there's a conflict. So which one will court see? Is
No,
it the
okay.
landlord or is it the provider?
No, it doesn't matter. Okay, yeah. So again, let's not get into what the court will do or not do. That one, even I cannot answer. Okay, but the genesis of the context is this: if you are a landlord providing your facility to someone else, you have the opportunity to set the rules. So if you set the rules, then the provider has to follow. If not, don't award them. But if you are the provider, okay, and you go to a place and you have all your systems in place, and the landlord tell you, look, no, you have to follow this rule because of A, B, and C, then you need to have a discussion. Again, this is about communication, consulting the stakeholders to decide whether which measure is more safe. All right, so you can always do more, right? You can say that ordinarily I don't use gloves, for example, to light fire. But in this context, the requirement is to use gloves because of A, B, C, D, E. Right? Then you have to have a discussion. Now again, it's not about who is right, who is wrong. Huh? We must not get into that mindset. It is about what is the safest for the participants and the staff. Right? And then different varying levels of safety, varying levels of risk. Some people may be more happy to take on more risk. Some people say, no, I don't want. So it depends. Okay? So when an incident happens, all of this will be taken into consideration. Sir?
Can I add to that? I think one basic thing that I learned from very... Can I add to that? One basic thing that I learned from very young in teaching. Okay? What would a reasonable person do? You have to ask yourself that. So sometimes to overkill also is not what a reasonable person will do. All the housewives and all that lighting fire at the gas stoves use lighter only blue gloves. So what a reasonable person will do. But then again, like I also begin to realize the context, less students light fire now. So I may not use gloves, but what I do is I wipe tongs. Because they don't want to burn themselves while holding the solid fuel. Actually, handling the lighter, quite safe because it's called a safety lighter for a reason. It's more they burning themselves when they light it. So what I think if you go by that question, and like I said, I agree with you, discussion, because I work with vendor quite across. Increasingly, I'm finding no, this is my area, that's your area. And then you want to argue about it. I think let's work together, right, for the benefit of everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Alfred. Maybe I will just add on to that. From the larger perspective, right, if you look at the current code of practice or the regulations, correct? Ask yourself as the occupier, which is, that means the owner, you have some legal responsibilities as a person, as an occupier, right? So whenever somebody comes to your premises, you gotta ask yourself, do you want to let that person do anything he or she likes to do? Because ultimately, when things happen, example, right, under the incident reporting regulations, you also have to report, no, as an occupier. So again, when you look at all this overarching framework, right, the answer is quite clear in terms of do this or get out, right? Therefore, sometimes for most organizations, right, before any contractors come on board, they must submit their RA, submit their safe work procedures. Then we say, yes, you can start work, for example.
Okay, so there's no more question.
Must charge you already.
Thank you. But I hope I clear most of it. Okay, so second last question is, what happened that is external conflict of against, for example, this is, I think, maybe some goes with some landlord. For my place, for example, I repeat the example. For example, my place, when you climb rock wall, you do not need to wear body harness. Example. You don't need to wear body harness. The provider agreed, okay, we do not need to wear the body harness. But the client, not even the client, okay, the client boss. Okay, the client boss. For example, the international school student came to my place, and the international school have a body SOP and said that no, they must wear body harness. Which one should we follow? The landlord SOP, RA, remember me this, RA, or the client's RA? That's not OB.
Thank you very much.
That's not OB.
Okay, without getting into specifics, I think you must understand the principle. Okay? What you're going to is very specific examples or you know, whether A wants to do this, B wants to do this, C wants to do this. Go back to what is the safest. Okay? So if you have stated that don't need, you may have some reasons why you don't need. You have done your own assessment. If someone else comes and says, I want to do so, they may have their own considerations. Then you guys got to work it out. It's not about who is right. Again, you cannot at the start of an activity start with the blame game. Then you never move. You cannot start the blame game based on RA is this, your RA is that. Like I said before, how you do an RA and how I do an RA can be very different. Doesn't mean that your RA is wrong or my RA is wrong or your RA is better than mine. It is about how you assess risk. What is your risk appetite? So if your appetite is higher and you feel that that's fine, they can climb, because if they fall down, I have a big airbag below that don't cause them injury, carry on. So it is very specific to your own requirements, and it's not about who is right and who is wrong. Once you get into that argument, right, or into that conversation, then something is very wrong somewhere. Then it's got nothing to do with safety as far as I'm concerned. If there is a wider issue you're dealing with already. Because people are then just using safety as an excuse. That shouldn't be the case. And that's where incidents will happen. Okay? Last one. Okay, Anand, sorry, I tell you what, I pause. There's another question behind. If you don't mind, we take the question behind first. Ken, then I'll come back to you.
Hi, thank you. I'm Julius. I'm a service provider for Kaki. I just want to check, because the whole framework is all about service provider, make sure we have things in place. I just like to ask the question, when there's risk, there's definitely a number to it. When a number is about high or moderate range, how do the OA framework help the user, the consumer, our client understand that this is an acceptable range? Because some will just, I want everything to be low. Does the framework help them to understand that in OE there are definitely moderate number to our risk assessment?
Okay, a candid answer is drop the client. No, I think if you go back to the code of practice, so it's a known thing that in the code of practice, any risk evaluated at high must be brought down to a low or moderate. Okay, so it's moderate or low. Okay, so if your client finds that moderate is not good enough, just show your client the code of practice and specifically ask them what are the concerns. Sometimes the concerns may not be the RA, but maybe something else. So again, communicate as part of risk communication. Ask your clients what's the issue in this case. Correct? That's our advice in this case in terms of what you can do.
So does the entire framework help the client to understand this, or is there something that they are able to justify this reasonable risk?
So right now, even without these standards, right, your core of practice is good enough already. Because what you're doing actually now adheres to a national standard or regulations that your risks are now evaluated to a moderate or to a low. Yeah.
So what Rizwan is talking about is the WSH code of practice. So go and download it. Okay, so you can use that. Right? When you set your programs, one thing I like to do when I set my SOPs, when I write my SOPs and programs, I always have a reference below. SOPs have taken reference from this, that, whatever. So upfront, you tell the client, I've already taken reference from some of these standards, some of these codes of practice. So if there's any ambiguity, as what Rizwan mentioned, you just go back to that. Right? And it's about communication. It's again about understanding. Because who doesn't want everything to be low? Of course, everybody wants everything to be low. Okay, but there has to be an acknowledgement that certain activities are dangerous by the activity itself. Crossing a road is dangerous, right? So it's about levels. It's about understanding what the activities and how to mitigate it. What's more important is you need to be able to display how you are mitigating and preventing an incident from happening. I believe if you can display that through your processes, training, whatever, that will give a lot of confidence and comfort to whichever client that's asking those tough questions. Okay. If no questions, we go back. Anand got one last one, so we can take his last question.
Thank you, Zan. Okay, my last question is, from both of your experience, experts' opinion, okay, I just need you to help me to break down the percentage of responsibility, because we have set up as a responsibility and law. We should do this, we should do that.
I can answer for you. 100% for all three. Everybody has 100% responsibility. There is no breakdown.
Yes. Because why? I just give this breakdown to understand which part of the three should follow who. There must be one person, there must be one on the side to make the decision. Cannot be all three. Oh, this is my best, this is my best, this is my best, this is my best. Or is there anything? Because the argument can be all the way throughout the whole 10 years.
No, so again, if you find yourself in the situation, then there is a bigger problem at hand. It's got nothing to do with responsibility. It's got nothing to do with risk. It's got nothing to do with safe work procedures. Okay, so all stakeholders are responsible. In fact, there's this tagline: safety is an individual responsibility. Means what? Even the person on the ground is responsible. There is no such thing that I am a worker, I follow, and something happened, I'm not responsible. No such thing. Everyone to the last person on the ground is responsible for safety. You are compelled, you should look out for safety. Okay, so if you are getting into those situations, then you are dealing with wrong partners, in my opinion. Because it's got nothing to do with safety anymore. It's got there is bigger issues at hand. Right?
And my last few words from me. If you want, you can just Google Ubin Adventure Resort case. Ivy Lim. That will give you some answer to your question in terms of, at the end of the day, when things happen, who was hauled to court and what did the court decide in terms of who have to pay who. Okay, so it's quite a long time ago lah. All right. So that's all the time that we have. No worries. I'll be here until the last person leave, so you can have your lunch and everything else. But I'll be here to ask any questions if you want. Yeah. So with that, thank you very much for spending your time with us.